Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We take from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against. We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our interview with the authors.
We know you want actions, not theories, and it's actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about, helping you to become a wicked company.
All right, Marcus, tell me again, how are you going to make green trousers out of this green screen that you had delivered this afternoon?
Yeah, well, they just sent the cloth and not sort of some kind of roll thing on it, so I either have to engineer one or gaffer tape it to the wall. I have no idea. Oh, made some trousers out of it. And
Yes.
then that's going to be some fun.
Yes, I think those are going to be really, really good trousers. And then we can do video and we can make all of your legs sort of disappear. But
Yeah.
All right, enough about the green screen. Who are we talking to today?
So today we're talking to Marti Konstant, who wrote a book called Activate Your Agile Career, which is a brilliant book about how you can take a bit more control over your career by helping you figure out who you are, what you can do, and sort of test things and using agile principles in order to apply them to your career and yourself, which is pretty cool.
It was really nice to talk to another fellow Midwesterner because she's calling in from Chicago. And of course, I was growing up in farmlands of Missouri and then lived in Indiana as well. But out of the book, and it was a really good book. It was incredibly well structured. And it's got a lot of stuff in it. I was glad that we kind of led the conversation in a direction that was more kind of how do leaders kind of do what they need to do. And I loved how she said, these companies want to be successful in the future of work and building good relationships with employees, it's about transparency and engagement. And that is a recurring theme, that the more transparent companies are with their leadership down to their employees and back again in that lines of communication, the more effective the individual companies are. And of course, we spent a fair bit of time talking about UBI, Universal Basic Income. And I loved that part of the discussion where we were trying to decide, okay, does it change someone's career path if they've got a basic income, yes or no? So I thought those were my two favorite parts and two takeaways.
So apart from takeaways, what would your two things then be around those insights of what you would tell a leader or an organization to do tomorrow?
So if I'm going to talk to a leader in an organization tomorrow after reading that particular book, I'm going to say, take stock right now about how you are communicating to your teams, and not just one direction, but how are you going to communicate back the other direction. So that's the first thing that I'm going to say. You're going to have to cut it there because I have no idea what the other thing is going to say. Give me a second. UBI doesn't really fall into a direction. I know we talked about this.
You can say that you have nothing to say, that UBI is more political thing. So I think that's out to be called or whatever, if you want.
So the second thing that I'll say is about UBI and Universal Basic Income, and that's much more of a political thing, but there's not a specific action that I would take if I was talking to a client tomorrow about that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I think so. The two things for me were, one is that, so she mentioned there are CLOs, Chief Learning Officers, which I was not aware of, or haven't come across one yet, which I think generally is an interesting idea, and I think something I would recommend organizations to have a look at if they're big enough, but not just necessarily to hire or consider a Chief Learning Officer, but somehow integrate learning a bit differently in a company, because if it is applied to everyone every day rather than just pulling people out into workshops but trying things at work or in their home time, I think we should look at different approaches. A lot of the workshop models don't quite apply. I've seen this in a lot of change and transformation. If you get people in for a week into a different room or a different building, teach them something, then within a week you lose a lot of what they have learned. So I think that's one of the approaches I wouldn't even recommend anymore. I think learn by doing, learn and train with people works way better in my experience. So, readdress how you learn and how people can learn and grow. The other part is also, and what I really liked is you look at design thinking or agile, and obviously Marty's using a lot of agile principles in her approach. Is that there's more and more things that we now have at work, from structuring your time to learning to, I would say, the big group of problem solving tools and skills that you can use on an individual level. And I would recommend that to leaders of an organization, to recommend it to their employees and say, look, everyone should use these things, should know these things, and look at how they're doing things themselves. And I think it would greatly enable people to have a different conversation and learn skills differently, and actually have a tool set that they can use in order to have a more structured approach to that. And I
Yeah,
find that
that's
quite great to have better and more tools on the individual level.
and that's it, and that's something that we talked about it this weekend, that now we're actually going to work really hard to deliver more value to our audience by giving specific actions and recommendations that we can make. So I'm really glad that we're doing this.
Yes, I think it's a great improvement, sort of getting that promise back. But let's go to the interview. Hello, everyone. Today we have Marti Konstant here with you. Hello, Marti, and thank you for making time for us.
Thanks so much for having me, Marcus.
So let's start, as usual, with a bit of context and background. So, Marti, if you could please tell us who you are and why you wrote the book.
Okay, I am Marti Konstant, and I am a workplace futurist. You might wonder, what the heck is that? I study everything there is about the workplace, technology, behavior, and what the future is going to bring. And I wrote this book called Activate Your Agile Career because I had been working in my marketing profession alongside many engineers and software developers who were using Agile as a process. And I thought, why not use this agility framework for one's career or even one's life?
And I think that's a great way to apply, that agile methodology. And as horrible as it is, I mean, agile is so misused and so misunderstood. And I like the way that you kind of set the context appropriately for the use of the word agile before you broke it down, and take people on a journey through I believe it's 7 different stages of building an agile career. So really nicely laid out and nicely pulled together. Rather than going through each of those individual steps, which would really be great for people trying to become an agile careerist or an agilist career. I forget which way you specified it. We want to talk a bit to our listeners who are oftentimes enterprise leaders. And what is it that they can do to kind of move that relationship back to where it was back in the 70s, when you had more employer and employee kind of loyalty and development, as opposed to the employer being almost optional and the employee being almost disposable. So how can you take some of the learnings that you've had as a workplace futurist? What do you see the future going, and what do leaders need to be doing?
That's a great, beautiful question, Troy. I think we want what we want. The organizations exist to be profitable and successful, and the individuals are doing the same. It used to be different back in the 60s and the 70s, when people were more loyal. My own father worked for a major corporation called United Airlines for years. It's the only job he ever had. So things have changed dramatically. And how can we make this applicable, or how can we meet somewhere in the middle for today's universe? And I
Mm.
would say to work on things like engagement and transparency. If there's not trust and transparency within the organization to its employer base, it's going to falter. And if there's, trust there, people are able to give more of themselves. And I think anything an organization or an individual can do to increase this engagement, all the better.
I've been saying for a number of years that what I do is I help enterprises to build trust through transparency. So that really, really resonates with me. I mean, a lot of times my focus was on permission for permission-based marketing. In the last decade, it's all about consumer data and access to consumer data. And, this is probably our 18th or 19th episode that we've done. And we hear a lot about how leaders are indeed being more transparent about the decisions that they make and how they're making those decisions and engaging their employee base to come along on that. So I think that resonates really well. And we talk about the future of work, and it's another one of those kind of trite phrases, and nobody really knows. But you're a futurist, so you must have a better crystal ball than most.
Right. So the future of work to me is one in which we both embrace the technology that is coming upon us right now. It's the fourth industrial revolution. We've got the AI, we've got bioengineering, implantable devices that help regulate things in our bodies. All of this is happening. And I think that the future of work is not just the technical part of it, but also how are we as emotional human beings going to adapt to this? I did a quick study in the last couple weeks, taking every survey I could find about what are the top skills or the soft skills. I call them power skills.
Hmm.
What are the top skills that people need? And I factored in existing research and I took in every article, major corporations, LinkedIn studies, Indeed.com, et cetera. And I came up on my particular list of emotional intelligence being at the top, adaptability being a strong second, communication being a strong third. This switches things around a little bit because of what our year has been, but the future is all about integrating personal beings with technology and embracing it.
That's really interesting because I think we had there seems to be two streams going on out there at the moment. Because when you look at organizations, there's a lot of talk about, well, we need to automate, we need to tool up, and we need to bring more tech into it. And at the same time, as you are saying, and your findings are definitely supported by bigger research like Google's Aristotle project, where they looked at the most effective teams with skills they have, and they all came out as the soft skills are actually the differentiator and make teams really, really successful. And there seems to be an odd discrepancy between sort of what organizations seem to be investing in, which is more tech, and what actually organizations really need, which are those soft skills. So how do you currently see when you looked at people talking about those emotional intelligence and so on? Where do you think that came from, or do you think that lands with organizations already, or are we just talking about it and organizations are still a bit stepping in the dark on that?
I do think that they're doing something about it. I belong to an executive learning exchange. It's a global group of CLOs, chief learning officers, HR people, people that have adapted to what has transpired in the past 9 months globally. And what I'm hearing from them, and I was collaborating on a presentation with a major insurance company, one of the largest in the world, and one of their top initiatives this year in terms of learning is to launch their soft skills program. Again, I call them power skills, but they're launching this program and they're going through modules every month. They have things slated for the next year. They consider this very important. Consider what an insurance company is. They have to have empathy. They have to have resilience. They have to understand what it's like for people that are hurting or whatever type of insurance that they are offering.
Yeah, and if you don't have the ability to have some level of empathy with your actual customers, you're really at a significant disadvantage. And I think that insurance is one place, especially when it comes to home insurance or life insurance or health insurance, where that's absolutely critical to be able to have. Um, Moving in a slightly different direction, away from empathy, almost to the other end of the extreme. The Cuba Gooding Jr. comment, "Show me the money," and that whole kind of drive. Because I think that whether it's a company saying, "Show me the money, I want profit and I want margin," or whether it's the individual who says, "Show me the money, I want my new car and I want to pay for my wedding and I want to do all of those amazing things," there is indeed a revenue driver. And I'm no longer in my 20s by a long shot, um, but I've kind of moved from discussing my career path to discussing a revenue path. So it's, how do I make the requisite minimum amount of money to maintain my lifestyle for myself and my family and enjoy what I'm doing? And I think your agile approach kind of crosses over into that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for invoking Cuba Gooding Jr. with Show Me the Money. That is one of my favorite movies, Jerry Maguire. It was really instructive. And that particular character learned what it was like to not just be about the money, right? So
Mm,
I have a saying. It's actually on my website, and it's actually what my white paper is about. I created a 30-page white paper. It took me about 9 months to research, and the title of it is cultivating happy, profitable employees.
mm,
Cultivate career agility. Don't reject it in your organization. And it's a double-sided meaning. The profits have to happen. The margins have to happen for organizations. They are going to be out of business if they are not making money. I understand this, but also they need to understand, and the individuals understand, that they also need to be profitable enough to care for their family, to make their investments, and to live for the long haul. And
mm,
this is entirely possible if organizations are arming their people with good training, are having them in the right roles rather than the wrong roles. If people are unhappy and unengaged, it's going to be a detractor. So if all of these things are optimized, or at least partially optimized, the organization's goals are going to be met, particularly in productivity areas that increase the bottom line.
mm. So
When we go on.
go on, Marcus.
So when we look in particular this, so I'm again playing a bit of devil's advocate here, I think, because you know, when we look at some of the projects I'm working on, which are sitting a lot in change and transformation, which have a lot to do with learning new skills and implementing new processes, there's a really heavy focus on being more effective. And effective seems to be, staying the same but polishing the whole thing a little better and heavily automating everything. And again, because I mentioned it before, there's a big focus seems to be in big investments in companies to automate in order to get rid of people. And then essentially that's the progress that a lot of organizations see to themselves. If we're talking about for example, a company of 100 people, and you say, people are getting less engaged because organizations don't value them as they should anymore. What would you say to an organization then who basically wants to become 20% more effective and therefore get rid of the workforce rather than retrain them and maybe teach them new skills that make them work differently and might bring in actually more value than just automating things? Because even automating things seems to be often a big investment and with small returns. A lot of digital transformation hardly bring any returns back. Whereas for my background, when I look at these soft skills or creative skills that are in people, they seem to be highly valuable and help a lot of organizations. But how do you communicate that when you communicate that to organizations? Do you do that, or is it more that should be driven by maybe people who work in companies who start taking their career in their own hands?
You've asked a lot of questions in that, Marcus, but I will
Yeah.
break it down a bit. I think let's address the issue, the concern about automation taking
Mm-hmm.
us over. I end up in the camp on the positive side of that, and definitely take a stand that things that are being automated are essential. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it's, I learn new systems and I hate it for the first 30 hours that I'm doing it. But once systems are in place, as they are in our healthcare system right now, a lot of charts are online. It's been going on for 20 years or 15 years, but it's finally here and it's really working and it's very efficient. So I think there's two things to think about here. There's the long term, and then there's the short term. The short term is really uncomfortable in the decision to automate. And I think this is where organizations could get a bad rap here, and the employees themselves could be a little short-sighted about where the future is. If I were an individual working in a tech company right now, what I would be doing, I would be sharpening up everything to do with automation, with artificial intelligence and the solutions. And I would be doing everything possible to become more of a partner with the machine. So the cobots of the world, where we're working with the automation. That 100-person company may not be the perfect example. Like a 10,000 person company may be more applicable, but eventually things do sort out and people end up doing other roles that will make automation possible. It's not a one-for-one match. Because we can talk about this maybe in another question, but there's a lot of things going on right now about how companies are becoming smaller and the consulting and gig economy is becoming much bigger. Is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? I happen to think it's a really good thing.
Mm.
Yeah, I
So,
think that's where quite a few voices are out there saying the same thing, and I'm happy you said that, because as much as some people are very scared about the automation and think, old skills fall aside, new jobs tend to be created that didn't exist before, right? And I think that's it seems to be the thing that is at least in half likely to happen, because I think, if you look at the internet and what that technology automated, but what kind of jobs that created and what kind of platforms it created jobs on top of it, is quite astonishing. But I'd like to go to maybe one of our more core questions when we're reading the book. And I think it's great when you picked up and how you picked up towards career and this agile aspect of testing things and so on. And for me, as a designer or a service designer and design thinker, it obviously reminded me of Stanford's life design course, where they use design thinking, probably with a mix of agile or something, sort of in that sense, to give students sort of an early idea of how they could figure out their lives. And there's some tools and things. How does sort of are you how much are you aware of what they're doing over there in Stanford, and how much does it sort of relate to what you've seen in your research for the book? Because
I
the
I
thinking
quote
reminded me.
Stanford. I mean, Bill
Yeah.
Burnett, Dave Evans, they're just masters, and they developed their thinking way back when. I've been a design thinker, enthusiast, and partial practitioner because of my work with agencies back in the marketing realm. That design thinking is a part of my soul. So yes, their work speaks to me, and how their work is maybe similar is they prototype things and they test and measure things, and they apply design research to the individual. Now we all know design research used to be applied to products, like Apple products, and the design thinking caused us to design a better mouse or a better handset for smartphones. So these are things associated with design thinking. So the prototyping, test and measure, absolutely similar. Some of the things that they say in their book is really about who am I, what do I want to do, and how do I get there, which to me sounds a lot like personal branding. There's a lot of parallels to their work with personal branding. You have to get that in touch with yourself to really be an effective employee, contributor, gig worker, leader, etc. Where mine might deviate a little bit is I rely heavily on agile concepts to a fault. And I have some principles within the career agility model that may deviate a little bit, like activating the the feedback squad and pursuing things in parallel. This is more of a project management perspective, pursuing things in parallel. So you might not see those kinds of things in Bill Burnett and Dave Evans' work.
Mm. So, do you know Professor Scott Galloway by any chance?
I do not.
Okay, so he is a relatively well-known marketing person. He's also known for his shaved head, his glasses, his crazy costumes, and he's an incredibly kind of big personality with an ego the size of Jersey. But in any case, he's currently running a strategy sprint, and I'm participating in this particular thing. And he talks about a career accelerant job. And so those jobs, like having a job at McKinsey or having a job at Google or having a job at Netflix, becomes a career accelerant job. And he then goes on to describe that one of the characteristics of those companies is how they move people out. Lots of people talk about how you hire those right people and what you do with those people, but then how you move them on. How do you place them inside customers? How do you place them in their next position? How do you move them in a way that's got a quote unquote a soft landing? And that's really, really important, especially related to the conversations we were having with regard to automation. Some jobs will no longer exist. And so people need to have the ability to say, I was in the right place, I've now moved somewhere else, and it was a good transition. And I would say, change isn't painful, but fighting it is. And that leads me to the question, finally, in a very roundabout sort of way, gig economy, running things in parallel. There's been a huge growth in gig economy jobs, whether they're driving for Uber or whether they're renting out a couch in their house on Airbnb or delivering on a bicycle with Deliveroo. And yet in California, we're seeing all of this pressure from the government saying, you're not a platform, you're an employer. And a bunch of these gig employees, gig economy workers are saying, we want to have all the benefits of being employed. Personally, I say, if you wanted a job, you need to go to get a job. If you want a gig piece, then you need to do gig work. But how do you see not only gig economy and gig work in the doing things in parallel, which you discuss in the book, but how do you see the change in the gig economy?
I think the gig economy is really interesting. I use the term gig economy along with the words consultants, contract worker, part-time worker, because it's difficult to say, what is the definition of a gig worker? The ones you are talking about are working for the platform companies, for sure. I'm of the very strong opinion that that's incumbent upon the individual. California, and as well as everything to do with Silicon Valley, however, sets the tone. They are the ones that pushed people up and out of the organization. Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn, created the concept of 2-year tours of duty, 2 to 3 year tours of duty. If
Mm.
you're not moving, you're not growing, and you're not adding innovation to my company. So it was really important to keep that stream going. So let's get back to the gig worker question you have, and that is that the gig workers have a lot going for them. The companies themselves are structured this way economically for a reason. They've become, as I think Marcus had said, more efficient in a variety of ways, not just to do with technology. If they don't exist like this, they will not exist in 5 years. They are doing what is necessary to keep their company growing and going. Now, there are some horrible decisions that may have been made in the last 20 years about outsourcing everything to the rest of the world that we could argue that that was not a good thing for companies to be doing
Mm.
in all different places of the world. But I think that the gig worker is a reflection of not just what the company wants, but what the people want. People wanted the autonomy and the flexibility. And these gigs were never designed to be full time. They were designed to be something they do on the side. Now, the fact that some people have turned them into full time, good on them. Good for them that they have done that. It works for them. But I've talked to an awful lot of Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, and I got to tell you, more than 50% of them are very happy with the flexibility that they have. And they're not interested in being employees.
Yeah, that's the survey kind of characteristics that I do too. And that's what I get. No, I want my flexibility. I don't want to be told what I can and cannot do and what shifts I have to work.
Right. So
Yeah,
it's,
and I think
again, it's
so.
the question that you asked was a much deeper question. It's, California has more propositions than I can count that they're voting on. And they are front runners and they are thought leaders. It's no mistaking that a lot of innovation happens in Silicon Valley because they're testing and they're trying out new things and they're changing the environment and they're inventing new companies at a faster rate than other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So I really admire the state in the innovation of the state, but this is not one that I admire.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it reminds me of when I go out, and I tend to sometimes sit here in the bars and pubs on my laptop and write and or edit podcast audio. And I see people who work there as waitresses or something, or waiters, and young people, and sometimes I get to know them, get to talk to them, and they sometimes sit there after their shift or before their shift on a laptop, and what they do is other things. So they work in the bar and then they have two other things going that eventually or sometimes already makes money for them. And I'm showing my age here, but I'm always curious what that new generation, the kind of TikTok generation, and kind of grew up with all these different channels, all these different opportunities, everything coming from either their mobile or their laptop. That's all they need. How they're going to develop into the new workforce, and if they're going to have this more atomized, maybe more agile approach and view on how this thing should be anyways. So they might already be prepped for that when we are still discussing, isn't that unusual? They're already used to it
Right.
because they're already living it. What do
I
you
mean,
think?
I don't even see it as unusual. I mean, I've had a bit of a portfolio career my entire life. I wasn't like my cohort as much because I was just too curious about things that were going on. I worked in marketing. I became a CMO. I did that, but always wanted to know what was around the other bend. It's not a coincidence that I moved from being a tech marketing leader to working in career development and career agility and workforce agility because it was so curious to me. So I think these young people, it's the Generation Z too, I can really relate to. They're always doing extra things on the side, and their curiosity inspires me. Now, I do know some millennials, a little bit older than the Gen Zs, that really like having a regular job as well, and they navigate quite successfully within an organization or a corporation. But the ones that I interviewed for the book, more often than not, they did not stay longer than 2 to 3 years in the job, just exactly like Reid Hoffman recommended for his own organization, LinkedIn.
Yeah, it's really, really impressive, I think, that movement. Which maybe then, maybe it's a hook, I don't know, maybe it's related, because I don't know what the answer will be, but my probably favorite question of today, and being quite short, is that, so Marty, tell us what happened 60 years ago, because you mentioned that in the book, and that there was some shift or something happening. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Okay, whenever I think of 60 years, and I thought of this when I
Mm.
was writing the book, I think of the series Mad Men. Mad Men in the 1960s on Madison Avenue, advertising executives, what the workplace was like in the 60s. And it was so different. It was more, that advertising bent was probably the most creative and outrageous thing of the time. But most of the corporations that they were serving were in offices and they were very predictable, and people worked for the organization. My father worked for the same organization his entire career. These are things that happened in the 60s and 70s. And things were, while we had civil unrest and we had things in the 60s that changed the world forever, even in the 60s, what we could count on in the workforce was this loyalty. Get a job at a good company, move up, maybe have two different jobs in your life, maybe three roles within that organization. My aunt worked for the same organization as well her entire career. So these things happened. And so after that time, what was happening then was this whole knowledge and automation and the information age and the first fax machine, and then the first mobile phone, I think, was developed. Well, at least one of them was developed in Motorola. It was quite a big
A
brick
brick.
phone. Yeah, it
Rick,
was quite
yeah.
a big brick phone, and there was a lot written about it. And that, some of that goes back even to the 60s and 70s. But as these things changed the world, and I think there was a book called The World is Flat 20 years ago, came out, and I remember thinking, wow, globalization is really happening. 20 years ago, I was just wide-eyed thinking, what's going to happen with all this globalization? There's going to be this outsourcing, and I was just really quite excited by it. I was quite excited that we could get things manufactured for cheaper somewhere else, and that we could design them somewhere else. Doesn't feel as good right now, but it was. I think we learned a lot from that, and I think it's to your point, Marcus, about it's again back to the concern about automation. Is what is going to be happening? Is this going to benefit me? And these things did happen, and this revolutionary age did enter, and the internet did start. And I used the year 2000 as a big pivotal year as well. Is it just absolutely changed the game. And the other year that I use as pivotal, and I just will never ever forget it, because I did an internship for Apple at one point, and in 2007 I was working for a mobile security company, so for mobile devices. Nobody cared about security in 2007 until the iPhone was invented, until there was a computer in our pocket, until you could just walk the streets and do all of your work on the fly. Another really pivotal time. So since the 60s, all these things have changed. And what's different now in the year 2020 is everything is much more compressed. We are not able to absorb this as long as we did in the 60s and 70s. We now have to absorb it, observe it, take note of the trends, create a strategy, and take action. We don't have the benefit. Our long-standing companies are going out of business. Who would have thought Kodak went out of business? Who would have thought Blockbuster? These companies now, even Apple and Google, if they don't stay on their game, they will not be in business.
Yeah. Funny story, small segue. From 1964 to 1972 was a TV series called Bewitched. And that was my first exposure to the Mad Men culture. And that was where I learned that drinking martinis was part of the workplace and having 2 and 3 martini lunches. So a lot of things have changed since that particular point in time. But if you go back to the 60s, the way we were just describing, people loved the stability. They got a regular paycheck. There was indeed this continuity that they could indeed rely on. And even though it is the year 2020, I still think there are some people that would love to have just that good, solid, reliable, stable foundation of income. And one of the popular topics right now in political spheres, and whether it's socialist democracies or socialism or whatever you want to call it, universal basic income, UBI, is a topic. How do you think if UBI came in, it would affect people's choices when it comes to their careers?
This is such a great question. I never heard of UBI until I went to California. I went to a 6 or 7 years ago. I went to an Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, a prototyping session of thought leaders got together, and we talked about what the future of work, how it was going to evolve, and we prototyped a bunch of ideas, and then they actually funded some of them. After that 2-day session. And during that time, people were talking about UBI. Coming from the Midwest, Chicago, we don't get things as fast. The conversation isn't the same. And I came back from that session talking about UBI in Chicago. People didn't know what I was talking about. So where do I weigh in on it? when I heard the arguments for why universal basic income is important for the lower paid workers, it kind of made sense to me the first time I heard it. I was a little skeptical, but then I looked around at me. I looked at downtown Palo Alto. I had been staying at an Airbnb that week, and it was the most expensive Airbnb I had ever stayed at. And I'm thinking, my goodness, it is so expensive to live here. How are all these people servicing these coffee shops and these restaurants and these gas stations and repair shops and stores? Where are they living and where are they coming from? And the obvious question is they don't all live in Palo Alto. They're coming
Mm,
from far, they're having really long commutes. And I got my social side of me up because had you introduced this to me at another time, I might not have been as open. But I think that we need to have conversation about this topic. I think if some jobs are going to be valued at a less than a way to make a living, if it's not enough for a person to live on, we need to talk about that because they are essential workers to the rest of the world.
mm.
So we have to figure out, it's not a simple solution. We have to figure out how to restructure the payment schedule or do UBI. I don't know if I'm a big fan of UBI as much as I am of looking at figuring out what we value. What we value our caregivers for our kids or our caregivers for older people. Like how much are they worth to you? They're worth a lot. Our teachers are worth a lot. A lot of
So
teachers do make enough to live on, but there's a lot of other people that don't.
I, I get that. I understand that. One of the big opponents of UBI says, well, if you give people that much money, nobody will bother to work. And that's been patently proven as untrue because people will find other work. It may not be work in the classic sense. It may be creating art. It may be doing caregiving. It may be doing a whole bunch of different things. But people will indeed find purpose. They're not just going to sit on their sofas and drink their beer and watch their televisions. But the particular angle that I was going for on UBI is how is it going to change Gen Z or Gen Z? How is it going to change the millennials and their career direction and their ability to make choices? Like, I'm in the wrong organization. I've got my UBI check. I can just leave. Or I take a job. It's going to give me great experience, but it's not going to pay me very much. It's okay. I've got my UBI. Do you think that will give people more choices or more direction? Because that's what I think.
Um, I agree with you, Troy, on that one. One of the things I compare it to is when people were first given affordable health care. So when it first came out on the market, I knew a bunch of single women that quit their jobs and started consulting businesses because they could get insurance. And what I
Right.
saw grow out of that were new businesses and new ideas, a greater happiness factor, some mishaps as well along the way, people going back to the corporate life. But I think when you take care of something, in this case that was healthcare, in your case just talking about the money that it takes to put food on the table, when you can take care of some of the basics, I do think that people can get very creative. I would be very I think this would have to be an extremely long conversation. I am not a big fan of UBI per se, but I'm a bigger fan of figuring out how to solve this disparity problem.
Mm.
And I don't have the answers. I'm just, put it right out there. I do not have the answers, but I think we're smart enough. I mean, why can't that be some of the things that are worked on in business school and in all of these great areas for design thinking? Why can't we design think our way in and out of this?
And if you did have all the answers, you'd be worth a whole lot of money.
Right.
Well, let me have a go at it. Well, not really, but I'm just looking at the time, and as usual, we don't have uh, little time, too many questions. So let me try to phrase maybe a final question to you, picking up a little bit in that area, because I think there's definitely something to be said about that people can, if we say people can design their own career or be more in control of their career and move and change and get into new places, then we're talking to some extent about constant learning. And constant learning, and it's great that you mentioned the position of the chief learning officer that I have never heard before. That's great addition to know that such a thing exists. When you look at that and you look at the contract that seemingly a lot of corporations been having with their community or with the rest of the planet, really, which is quite simplistic and doesn't necessarily take these learning things into account. And to give one example, what I mean by that, there's some industries, and I've seen things existing, in particular, for example, in the advertising industry, because I used to work for some ad agencies some years back, so I've seen a bit of that as well. There seems to be this habit of creative teams where you hire creative teams when you see they've won some awards somewhere, and then you hire them, and then you throw them on some campaigns and some client work till they sort of spill their ideas, and eventually you sort of sack them and you get yourself a new set of teams. What I haven't seen in agencies, and especially the bigger ones, there doesn't seem to be a learning in that industry. It's more like, oh, we just grab someone who's just done something smart that we know. And I think it was Sir Martin Sorrell who commented on that to say, our industry doesn't train people. They don't get them to learn anything, which was a big issue, I think, around advertising and digital, because advertising took a long time to pick up digital properly. So what's your angle then on exactly that, when we say, right, if we talk about learning and if we talk about that, is there a different contract than that organizations should have? Because the universal basic income is sort of a little bit like that, but it's more governmental. The other one would be talking about a new type of organization. So what do you think about that? That some industries are sort of sitting there and their contract needs to maybe change in terms of learning.
Yeah, so the contract with the advertising and creative world is interesting to me. I did mention Mad Men, and I was laughing about this, Marcus, to myself, because the characters in that show, they weren't agile at all. They Draper went into a dark cave, and drank a bunch of liquor and came up with brilliant ideas overnight, and then pitched it to the client. And he may have had a 20% hit rate or a 50% hit rate. I don't know if it was measured exactly. But in the agile world, it's about getting input. So it's in addition to the learning equation that you're talking about, Marcus, I think it's about the inclusion of everyone's ideas and input. So today in a smart creative team, they are going to include the client, and they're going to inform the client of initial concepts that are raw, and have them be a part of the process. And they're going to have other people within the client organization to be a part of that process. Because guess what happens when people are part of the process and there's more minds that can meld this together? There's better creative solutions. You can't rely on the creative team, the writer and the creative person, to always come out with this perfect idea. So I think if my pitch here would be for agility is that agility and adaptability need to be learned, and curiosity need to be accessed by these teams so that they can learn an agile marketing way of doing things versus the way that it's been done before. There's whole teams, there's whole organizations right now that are getting trained in agile marketing. Only about 10% of the organizations in the US are really trained in agile marketing techniques, but it's a thing, and it's very relevant to the creative industry, and it's inclusive, another important word of today.
Lovely. I think it's always lovely to hear, when you see something that, and a lot of things come from technology. Agile is one of these examples, and you start using them in different areas, and they sort of slowly trickle up to, marketing strategy and other areas, and we start using it. And I think it's wonderful to see it the way you explain it in your book, that people can use it on their own life and to explore and improve and be a bit more in control of what they want to do and who they are. So therefore, at this point, I would like to say thank you so much for your time and your insights, Marty, and thank you for being on the show.
Troy and Marcus, it was great. Thank you so much. Appreciated the conversation. It was enlightening.
Thank you. You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.